Okay, so in this section, we're going to be going over section 2 of chapter 10, which is the second to last section, actually. And this is mainly going to be sort of a historical lecture, actually. So, this is going to take on the events of American banking from the 1700s to the 1800s and how that has impacted even modern banking today. We'll talk about how it stabilized in the late 1800s, but we're also going to follow up with the Great Depression later on as well, which you probably already know a little bit about it from US history, but that started in the 1900s. And so some of the similarities with what people faced during the 1700s and 1800s will definitely carry on in the Great Depression era. So, first we should talk about two views of banking. So, Federalists and Anti-Federalists had their different sets of beliefs regarding a central government. Federalists were in favor of having a central government where we would have the federal government kind of have some more control over the banking system and to monitor the banks that were state and local level, because they felt that it would make the banking system more stable, more secure, and more trustworthy to everyday citizens. Anti-Federalists believed that a central government would actually not be a good idea for the people because they felt that it would limit the rights to investing, to saving, any sort of banking activity. They felt that if the government had too much power over it, then it would give little power to states, to local governments, and to the people themselves. And the followers of Federalists were Alexander Hamilton mainly. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was in favor of the anti-federalist view of centralized banking. So, if we take a look at the specific events that follow, you'll see that there were certain periods of time where we did apply the central banking system. However, it was only temporary for quite a while. So, with the first bank being created of the United States, this was in 1791, and this was our first show of a centralized banking system. So the bank held tax revenues, which basically meant that they had an amount of taxes that they would collect from us in turn to fund these banks, and they would issue out representative money. So, in other words, banks basically had this representative money to signify that that was how much money that they could collect in real hard cash, and monitored state chartered banks. So afterwards, a lot of people who followed who aligned their beliefs with decentralized banking, as was followed by anti-federalists, this led to the first bank becoming less popular. And so when its charter was nearing its expiration date, it was decided that it wouldn't be renewed. So it had expired in 1811, and so the first Bank of the United States was no longer a thing. Then the second Bank of the United States came along, and this was created in 1816 and was responsible for restoring stability after the following issues regarding our banking system when the first bank had expired. So it in fact, once the first bank was no longer a thing, it in fact led to decentralized banking, which actually became a nightmare. People started to realize that a lot of local and state banks had their own currency value, which meant that if you were, putting in money in a bank from another state, the currency value could look different. Or sometimes certain banks got away with actually having money being deposited into their bank system without actually having the reserves to back up how much money they were keeping inside. And so people started losing the trust. So that's why the second bank was created. However, we see another similar situation as the first bank, with people losing trust in this idea of centralized banking system. So they didn't renew the second charter. And so another period dominated by state chartered banks, as in state banks were the ones with most of the power, took hold. And again, along with this, unfolded a lot of issues that were similar to what happened when the first bank had expired. So the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 allowed the central government to charter banks, require that banks had adequate reserves of silver and gold so that they did have representative money, and to issue a single national currency so that not all, like, there weren't any currencies that were different among the states. And so in 1900, the nation shifted to what was called a gold standard. This is actually not a thing today, and we'll talk about that later as we move on to more modern times with banking. But this is a monetary system where paper money and coins are equal to the value of a certain amount of gold. So again, it's the idea of representative money, and it has two pros to it. One is that it gives a definite value of the dollar. You can weigh gold, you can measure it based on that, so it's fairly easy. And the government could also only issue currency if it had gold in its treasury to back its notes. So that became a requirement. And so you can see that after centralized banking became once again in popularity, it was no longer okay for banks to get away with not having these reserves. So now we can focus on banking in the 20th century. So in 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created, and this system still exists today, and it's our first true central bank. The Banking Act of 1933 then created something called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We just call it FDIC. It used to basically what it was intended to do was to make sure that if a bank closed down for any reason and people were worried about, well, how would you withdraw your money if these banks are closing? The FDIC is basically like insurance. It insures your deposits up to $100,000, but now $250K because money is different in its value today, right? It's a lot less valuable than it used to be in 2020. But yeah, we do not have the gold standard any longer. I believe it was taken away during, I want to say Nixon's presidency, or it was Bush's. But yeah, so yeah. So that's pretty much it for this section. We only have one section to go over, so we'll probably go over that next class. But yeah, hopefully that was helpful.